Welcome in to CBS News 24/7. I'm Mugo Odigwe. Over 1 hour and 30 minutes. That is how long that high-stakes phone call between President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin lasted today. On the line, the future of the Russia-Ukraine war and a 30-day ceasefire that could put an end to the bloodshed in cities across the region. Ukraine has already agreed to that proposed deal. Russia, on the other hand, says they need more discussions. Here's what's on the table. Land and specific assets like power plants. This map shows the U.S. Ukrainian territory shows us the Ukrainian territory that Russia has already taken over. CBS News senior White House reporter Jennifer Jacobs joins us live from Washington. Jennifer, good to see you today. A 90-minute phone call, right? So in your opinion, is there any significance to the length of that phone call?
It was actually even longer than that, Mugo, and I do think that that's significant. I think that it lasted around 2 hours, perhaps even a little bit over 2 hours. We'll get final details on that, but I do think that that is significant. If President Trump was able to keep President Putin on the phone and able to really hash through everything, because President Trump has said that almost all of the elements of this deal were in place already before his phone call with President Putin. President Trump knew exactly what his agenda was going to be like for today's call, and he told us yesterday that he had just a few more things that he needed to iron out with Putin. So if this phone call lasted around 2 hours, that is a good sign that there is something happening. Also, there was a social media post from President Putin's special envoy, who's kind of the equivalent to the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, the Russian version of Steve Witkoff, posted on social media that he thinks that the world is a safer place today thanks to what President Putin and President Trump talked about today. So that seems like a positive sign. We're getting signals that there were things accomplished on this phone call.
Okay, hopefully we'll learn more soon enough about exactly what was discussed. But let's bring back that map because it basically shows you the places that Russia has taken over pretty much at this point. But could Russia be forced to give up some of the territory that they now control as we look at that map on the screen right here?
Yeah, White House officials have signaled privately and a little bit publicly that they do think that some land, some territorial concessions might be part of a deal. President Trump has said he just wants to get to a 30-day ceasefire to start with and then the peace deal later. And I do think that the Trump administration is willing to negotiate and make some concessions. I think Ukraine is more worried about commitments that maybe that will make them uncomfortable. I know European officials have told me that they're worried about this request from Putin that all military shipments to Ukraine are paused. It would just be a temporary pause until the final peace deal is agreed to. But I know European officials are trying to scramble to get as much military supplies to Ukraine as possible before any deal is inked so they can get it there before the deadline.
Right, and that's because there's always that question of whether or not Putin can be trusted. Where did the negotiations on this 30-day ceasefire go from here? I know you mentioned that Trump is basically saying, let's first of all have these conversations first, and then we can talk about peace down the road. But for the 30-day ceasefire, what do you think comes next?
Well, I know the White House has wanted this deal for a week now. It's been a week since I was over in Jeddah with the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and they had been talking to President Trump on the phone, and he was saying that after Ukraine had agreed to the 30-day ceasefire, the president wanted the second half immediately. So we just don't know yet. Until we get that readout from the White House, it's just impossible to say quite yet where this will go. I know everyone is waiting, some nervously, some excitedly, to hear some of the details about what happened. I would imagine that they're going to have to go back to Ukraine again and get approval from President Zelensky if concessions were made.
All right, we shall wait and see. Jennifer Jacobs, live for us at the White House. Thank you so much for your time today. And there are new developments from just minutes ago in a legal battle over the president's power to order deportations. The White House has put 200 Venezuelan migrants on a flight to El Salvador over the weekend. Now, despite a federal judge's order halting that deportation, the White House went ahead and did it anyway. They pushed back, saying the order came way too late, and the flights were already in the air at that time. CBS News Department of Justice reporter Jake Rosen joins us now. Jake, good to see you on the stream today. The federal government had a noon deadline to submit information to the judge. Do you know what came out of that?
Yeah, and some of that information that stemmed out of yesterday's hearing, in which the government really didn't have answers on further details of further deportation flights of these alleged Tren de Aragua members, in addition to more details about what actually happened between the implementation and signing of the Alien Enemies Act from Friday into Saturday. In these filings that are public, there's a statement from an acting ICE a worker who basically says that he was told that the order was signed on Friday and that it was public on Saturday, which raises concerns that were raised by the ACLU of what did the administration do before that was officially enacted to get these migrants basically all set for deportation before they hit send on the press release. But the better details that we've really seen today are the administration says there are about 250 other alleged Tren de Aragua members, both known and detained, some of them undetained in the United States that the government is keeping tabs on, that they are hoping to continue to deport. So that would be, again, probably another flight or two worth of people. In addition to that, the ICE worker basically said that he felt that these flights that were sent were out of U.S. airspace by the time the judge actually issued his written order, which has been really at the crux of this all. The government has said that they didn't believe that because the judge's order was not in writing to turn the planes around, that they were beholden to that. And basically, as a result of all of this, these two planes were on the ground in El Salvador. The Salvadoran government took these alleged gang members into custody, and now they're in the in the Salvadoran prison system.
So President Trump, as he's known to do, blasted the judge overseeing the case on social media today. He called the judge a radical left lunatic, a troublemaker and agitator sadly appointed by Barack Obama. He then went on to say the judge should be impeached. Jake, this post prompted a rare response from a Supreme Court justice. Can you tell us about that?
That's right. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who rarely does this in terms of responding to political rhetoric from either side of the aisle, said in a statement just moments ago that, quote, for more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. So, again, Chief Justice Boasberg, who has issued this, has basically stood with a lot of the justices who have been on the hot seat in this D.C. district relating to January 6 cases, and he has a long history with the president. We saw Justice Roberts basically saying that if Donald Trump has a problem with that, his administration should appeal. Now, the Department of Justice has already appealed Judge Boasberg's decision in this case. We have not heard arguments on that yet. We will in the future, but he basically says to suggest that, as Elon Musk has as well and other Trump allies, is completely inappropriate.
Wow. Okay, let's switch gears here for a minute, Jake. So a judge in Maryland just ordered certain federal education grants to be restored. They were canceled by the Trump administration. What are the details on this one?
Yeah, and this is part of that big grant pause that we saw as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the government. These specifically were in the Department of Education. Some of them are seed grants, which basically gives money to educational programs around the country. These programs were canceled illegally, a judge found today in a preliminary injunction, so more than just a temporary pause in this case, and ordered that within 5 days, the Department of Education must restore funding to these grants. Now, you have to kind of take a bigger view here of, as this is all happening, as the Trump administration is trying to shut down and dismantle the Department of Education. So we'll see whether this gets appealed. It is certainly likely to, because it's going to be very difficult for, as we saw with the USAID and other government programs, for them to keep spending money as they're trying to completely cut this entire department.
Right. Well, we shall wait and see. Jake Rosen, thank you so much for your time today. A Columbia University student who fled to Canada after federal immigration agents showed up at her door is speaking to CBS News about why she made the decision to self-deport. She left just days after the detention of pro-Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil. Let's take a listen to her conversation with CBS's Lilia Luciano.
What was your biggest fear? That I would be detained indefinitely. That was really my greatest fear. And with little legal recourse to fight anything that they throw at me. I have done nothing wrong, and I was unsure why they were sort of persecuting me.
How did it feel to have those agents knocking on your door? What were you going through?
terrified. I was still on Zoom with my advisor, and she was telling me everything was fine.
A delicate ceasefire shattered with an onslaught of attacks in Gaza, and the Israeli government warns this won't be the end. Details when we come back. You're watching CBS News 24/7. The fragile ceasefire that's held for nearly 2 months now in Gaza has been shattered after Israel launched deadly airstrikes in the territory. The Hamas-run health ministry says more than 400 people were killed in the widespread strikes. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he took military action to force Hamas to release the remaining hostages held for 17 months and warned more strikes are to come. The UN's Office of Human Rights had this response today.
We are horrified by last night's Israeli airstrikes and shelling in Gaza, which killed hundreds, according to the Ministry of Health in the Strip. This will add tragedy onto the tragedy. The last 18 months of violence have made abundantly clear that there is no military path out of this crisis.
And joining us now to discuss these developments is Jamil Jaffer, founder and executive director of the National Security Institute. Jamil, thank you for joining us. Good to see you again. Do these airstrikes mark a return to war, or do they appear to be a limited operation with the goal of just putting pressure on Hamas?
Well, Mugo, we'll see. It's hard to know right now because we don't know how long they're going to go on for, but certainly an immediate concern is to put pressure on Hamas. There are still 59 approximately hostages remaining in the Gaza Strip of the 250 that were originally kidnapped. About half of those were expected to not still be alive, unfortunately. So about 30 living hostages that we're talking about. And now Hamas, for their part, has said, look, we'll give you one American Israeli hostage and 4 bodies. They agreed to that last Friday. So there is some negotiation going on, but not nearly enough for what the Israelis want and expect to get to a further stage in these negotiations and to apparently continue the ceasefire.
Yeah, and on the backdrop now, we're talking 400 people, at least according to the Hamas Health Ministry, who have died from the airstrike. So we're talking more lives killed here. But many in Israel are wondering what the shattered ceasefire will mean for the dozens of hostages you mentioned there still being held. Is there any further path to negotiations at this point?
Well, look, at the end of the day, what's got to happen is they've got to agree to a process like the one they had before, where Hamas was releasing a number of hostages, the Israelis releasing, 15, 20x that number of Palestinian prisoners in exchange. We're talking, I think we saw about 30 releases in the last few weeks and about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners released from the Israeli side. So that negotiation's got to happen. Because Hamas has been stalling for a little while, I think the Israelis felt like, look, we've got to re-up the pressure. And the question is this a one-off thing, or will this take a longer time? And the real question is, when does Hamas come back to the table? And can you really destroy Hamas? Because as you see at each of these hostage releases, there's tons of fighters still standing around with weapons, ready to go to war. And that's, I think, the real challenge for Israel is they see a continued buildup with Hamas even after these airstrikes.
Yeah, and we know the Arab world, they're condemning Israel. We also heard from the UN earlier, but they're condemning Israel's escalation, while Hamas is blaming the United States for providing unconditional military support to Israel. What could the United States do at this point to help resolve the conflict?
Well, look, Mugo, at the end of the day, what we've got to see is Hamas has got to put down its weapons and not continue the kind of tactics it's engaged in. If you think about what happened on October 7th, it was the equivalent on a population-adjusted basis of a dozen 9/11 attacks, right? And you think about what the U.S. did after 9/11. We went to war for 20 years, went around the globe, and took out terrorists, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, to prevent attack on the homeland. So it's not surprising the Israelis are continuing to fight this conflict as they see Hamas. And mind you, they still have, 60 Israeli hostages, probably 30 or so of them alive, some of them American, that need to come back as well. And so it's no surprise this war is continuing. Hamas is unwilling to put its weapons down until that can happen or it's destroyed. I think you'll see this conflict at some level continue.
Wow. We'll wait and see. There's some progress on that. Jamil Jaffer with the National Security Institute, thank you so much for joining us on the stream today. Texas has made what appears to be its first arrest under the state's controversial abortion law, which bans abortions after about 6 weeks. As CBS News national reporter Karen Waugh tells us, the 48-year-old woman arrested is a midwife who operates multiple clinics in the Houston area.
So a lot has unfolded in the past 24 hours. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton announced the arrest of one person yesterday and two more today. So let's go back to yesterday. We're told a Houston midwife, Maria Margarita Rojas, was arrested. Officials say she owns several clinics in the northwest Houston area where people were practicing medicine and providing medical treatments without licenses. Now officials say Rojas has been arrested and charged with providing illegal abortions, which in the state of Texas is a second-degree felony. Now this morning, AG Paxton announced the arrest of two more people. One of them is 29-year-old Manuel Lay. We're told he's a medical assistant at one of Rojas' clinics up in Waller, and we're told that he helped perform at least one abortion there. We're also told the other person is 54-year-old Rubildo Matos. He's a nurse practitioner who's now being charged with practicing medicine without a license. So just a little bit of context here in terms of Texas law. Since 2022, all abortions have been banned. There are no exceptions for rape or incest. The only exception is if the life of the mother is in danger. Now, the state will usually charge the abortion provider rather than the patient and hold them criminally responsible. Officials are able to fine those abortion providers up to $100,000 per abortion. We've seen in recent months the state of Texas has been really cracking down on clinics and individuals who've been providing these illegal abortions. Back in February, a Texas judge had fined a New York doctor for prescribing abortion pills to a woman in the Dallas area. In this situation, our team has reached out to all three of the people arrested, but we have not gotten a response yet. Back to you.
Our thanks to Karen Waugh for that report. We're watching a few court cases today, including the federal corruption trial for the wife of former New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. Nadine Menendez is facing 15 charges in a years-long bribery scheme, which involved her husband. Less than 2 months ago, Bob Menendez was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Nadine, though, she pleaded not guilty. So let's bring in CBS News correspondent Chanel Call. She's live in our newsroom. Chanel, good to see you again at this hour. What are we expecting in court today, and why is Nadine's trial starting months after her husband's trial?
Yeah, a good question there, Mugo. Good to see you, too. Nadine Menendez's federal corruption trial gets underway today. And what we'll see happen here in New York City is jury selection begin. She faces 15 charges in this years-long bribery scheme that also involves her husband, former U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, who is a Democrat from New Jersey. Now, the couple, just to recap, people, they're accused of accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes in exchange for political favors that prosecutors allege benefited themselves and the Egyptian government. Those bribes also, Mugo, allegedly included cash, gold bars, and a Mercedes-Benz. Now, 2 months ago, people may remember Bob Menendez was sentenced for 11 years in prison for similar charges in this case. His wife's case, though, was delayed. This was to allow for her breast cancer treatment. So she now has pleaded not guilty to all the charges in this case. But before the trial kicks off, 12 jurors will need to be chosen. So that process begins today. This could take hours or even days.
Okay, Chanel, I also want to ask you about a few hearings going on today surrounding the Trump administration's firing the heads of independent agencies. Let's start with Kathy Harris.
Yeah, lots to get through here. So Kathy Harris is a member of the Merit Systems Protection Board. And back in 2022, she was appointed to a 7-year term by former President Joe Biden. But then last month, President Trump terminated her, she says, without cause. So in response, she filed a lawsuit against the president over this. And then a month ago, the district court temporarily reinstated her. The president then appealed that move, and then a few weeks later, a federal judge found that she was unlawfully removed from her position. But again, the government appealed that ruling too. So today, Mugo, we will begin to hear some oral arguments in this case.
Wow, there's a back and forth on that one. And I also want to ask you about a different case, Wilcox versus Trump. Can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, another similar story here with Gwen Wilcox-Mugo, who is a member of the National Labor Relations Board. So she was also fired by the Trump administration lately, and then she also legally challenged that termination. Earlier this month, a federal judge ordered her to be reinstated to that position and also called her firing, quote, a blatant violation of the law. So in response, the administration then appealed that ruling. So basically today they're going to try to persuade a federal appeals court to block the rulings that sent both her and the other person in this case, both illegally fired independent agency officials, back to work.
All right, CBS News correspondent Chanel Call, thank you so much for joining us and for all that information today. We appreciate it. Okay, some breaking news out of the White House right now. What we're learning about President Trump's phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's next, right here on CBS News 24/7. Welcome back to CBS News 24/7. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is defending his decision to help Republicans avoid a government shutdown. Schumer, along with 9 other Democrats, voted in favor of that stopgap bill. It's led to some calling for him to step down from his leadership position in the party. Here's Schumer on CBS Mornings earlier today.
Why not use your vote to push back and fight?
Because the idea that they would go to the negotiating table is they don't do it. This is a new group. This is not the old group. Let me explain. I knew when I took this vote there'd be a lot of protest, but I felt I had to do it for the future, not only of the Democratic Party, but the country. Because here's as bad as that CR bill was, and it was bad, a shutdown is 10 times worse. Let me give you what happens.
Been blamed on the Democrats.
And you're right, Gail. People ought to know that. The executive branch, in this case, Musk, Doge, and this horrible guy Vogt, who have no concern for working people, would have had sole power to determine what opens and what closes. They determine what is essential. You can't go to court. So on day 2, get rid of SNAP and food for hungry kids. It's not essential. Day 4, get rid of mass transit aid. Let New York City do it. Not essential. Cut back on Medicaid and health care. Within 2 weeks, everyone would have been howling.
Now, the anger over his decision has led Senator Schumer to postpone his book tour, citing security concerns. Switching gears right now, because 2 long-delayed Starliner astronauts are on their journey back home to Earth, and you're looking at the moments the crew closed the hatch of the SpaceX Dragon capsule. And here's that capsule undocking at the International Space Station. Starliner astronauts Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore are sharing their ride home with another astronaut and a cosmonaut. But it is a long, of course, you wouldn't disagree with that, right? A long overdue trip for Williams and Wilmore after spending 9 months at the ISS. The pair were on a planned 8-day research mission last June, but a propulsion issue forced them to stay in orbit way longer. They orbited the Earth more than 4,500 times and traveled 121 million miles. But now they are scheduled to splash down off the Florida coast tonight. It should happen just before 6 p.m. Eastern time in the Gulf, about 70 miles south of Tallahassee. CBS News senior national correspondent Mark Strassman joins us live from the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Good to see you, Mark. What should we expect to see during re-entry and landing?
Hey, Mogo, good to talk to you, too. Essentially, we're going to have, a homecoming that is maybe 9 months overdue. And right now, it's about 4.5 hours away from splashdown. So you're going to watch the capsule, about at 18,000 feet. The capsule's main parachutes will open. The descent will slow. The drogue parachutes will open. It will slow even further, down to about 15 miles an hour, and then it will splash into the Gulf. And that begins sort of the final stage of the homecoming itself. The capsule with the crew inside will be hoisted onto a recovery ship, and then by helicopter they'll go to the Florida Panhandle, and from the Florida Panhandle they will jump aboard a NASA jet and fly for a homecoming here in Houston. Again, this is something their families, of course, are really looking forward to, is seeing their loved ones again. The astronauts have said to us, all along that space is their sweet spot, and they have really loved their extended stay in space. But I guess all good things must come to an end, and that's going to happen today for Wilmer and Williams.
Yeah, but I will admit, I'm sure their family members are looking forward to them finally coming back home. So looking forward to that one for sure. Mark Strassman, thank you so much for joining us on the stream. We appreciate your time. I'm breaking right now new details on that phone call between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The phone call lasted for over an hour, here in actually close to 2 hours. Now, remember, the White House is looking to ink a deal and put an end to the bloodshed taking over the region. That phone call is a key step in making this happen. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is live at the White House now with more information about that call. Ed, good to see you. What do you know?
Mugo, the headline out of this statement from the White House is that they appear to have agreed, the president and the Russian leader, on a ceasefire for, I want to describe it as energy and infrastructure ceasefire, and that negotiations over a permanent ceasefire and ultimately peace, quote, will begin immediately in the Middle East. The statement from the White House saying that President Trump and President Putin spoke about the need for peace and a ceasefire in the Ukraine war. Both leaders agreed this conflict needs to end with a lasting peace. They also stressed the need for improved bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. The blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending in this war would be better spent on the needs of their people, this statement says. Later, it says that that the conflict should never have started and should have been ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire, and permanent peace. These negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. It says the two of them also spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts. They further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons and will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. The two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel, a notable bit of the conversation given what's going on in that region of the world this day. The two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upside. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. So, they're not saying it explicitly, but it sounds like what is being announced here is that Russia's agreeing to the ceasefire arrangement, and that ceasefire talks will commence immediately somewhere in the Middle East. Most of them so far, at least regarding Ukraine, have been held in Saudi Arabia. We'll see if it's Saudi Arabia or somewhere else. As expected, this call then also touched on the overnight hostilities that flared up again between Israel and Hamas, and then the broader goal that the president has stated of renewing and restoring U.S.-Russia relations beyond this conflict to a broader economic and geopolitical relationship, getting it back to what it once was. That's been a stated goal of President Trump since his first term, and one that he certainly had campaigned on and is pushing for right now. So we'll wait for more details on where exactly these ceasefire talks would commence, what exactly did Russia ask for during the call, what else was discussed. There is some reporting from the Russian news agency TASS that the two presidents agreed to keep in touch. There may be some kind of a prisoner of war swap being prepared between Russia and Ukraine, and that they will keep talking about what part of Ukraine's territory exactly is really up for discussion. So we'll see what else beyond that. But again, a sign that this was a successful call in that there are at least agreements to keep talking, and perhaps more specifically and more urgently about a broader and permanent ceasefire and ultimately peace. We also will wait for what the Ukrainians make of this and whether they are party to these talks that are set to begin, according to the president's statement, immediately in the Middle East, and who exactly from the Ukrainian side might be involved in those. There is no current plan for President Trump to talk to President Zelensky, for example, about what went on today. We'll hear about whether any U.S. official is briefing the Ukrainians, or if this is just going to proceed with the Ukrainians on the sideline. That would be, of course, a huge departure in how the U.S. has handled this situation during the Biden years, but that has been the point of the Trump administration, to do it differently. And it's resulted in this call that, as you said, lasted under 2 hours, started around 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We had been told it would begin somewhere between 9 and 11 a.m. Eastern Time. and it went on into the 12 p.m. Eastern hour, and it has resulted in this statement. We also don't have a full readout, by the way, from the Russians, so we'll wait and see if they have anything more to say, Mugo.
All right, we shall wait and see. Ed O'Keefe live for us from the White House with some breaking news. Really appreciate your time this morning on the stream. Thank you. Afternoon, I should say. Now let's bring in Mark Cancian. He is the senior advisor with the Defense and Security Department at the Center of Strategic and International Studies. Mark, thank you for joining us as well. I want to read a piece of what was just said from the White House. They say, quote, "The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire, and permanent peace." Now, these negotiations will continue immediately in the Middle East. Your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's both encouraging and discouraging. It's encouraging because the two countries are talking. There's no indication in the whole statement that there was any bitterness or any break off of talks. In fact, they've talked about continuing the discussions, but it's disappointing because they did not agree to a 30-day ceasefire. I mean, at the front lines, they're going to keep shooting at each other. They agreed to stop attacking each other's infrastructure and energy. Both sides have been attacking the other's infrastructure. And then they said that they'll continue talks about a ceasefire. Sounds like the first thing will be some sort of maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, and then, of course, a permanent peace settlement. So this is the first step of what's probably going to be a very long road and a little disappointing. I think many people had thought that the killing would stop. At this point, it's not going to.
Yeah, and I know you say this is disappointing, and you did also very much point out the fact that they did not agree to that 30-day ceasefire deal that Ukraine had said they are willing to accept. But in your opinion, do you think this is a positive step to finally, hopefully, putting an end to this war?
Oh, it's certainly a positive step because ending attacks on infrastructure and energy is an important reduction in the suffering of civilians on both sides. So that's good in itself. It just isn't the big step I think that many had hoped for.
Right. And I want to bring back the topic of Ukraine here, because initially Volodymyr Zelensky, the president there, had said, yes, he is open to that 30-day ceasefire deal. And now they're not necessarily getting the ceasefire deal they had hoped for. And this conversation was between President Trump and President Putin. Do you think at some point Ukraine will be brought back to the table to continue these discussions?
Well, I certainly hope so. It would be fair that when its future is being discussed, that it have a role in the discussion of that future. President Trump has preferred to deal one-on-one, deals with President Zelensky, deals with President Putin. We'll see what happens in the Middle East when they continue these discussions. But although I would certainly hope that they bring in not just Ukraine, but also Europe, so far, President Trump's approach has been one-on-one.
So in your opinion and your expertise, what do you think should come next at this point? After this phone call, which was almost 2 hours long with President Putin and President Trump, what's the next step in your opinion?
It sounds like the next step is another meeting in the Middle East like they had a week ago. And maybe they can do something on the maritime ceasefire, maybe even on a 30-day ceasefire. But that's probably as far as they're going to get. As I said, this is looking to be a very long process. Keep in mind that the negotiations to end the war in Korea and the war in Vietnam took years, not weeks.
Right. So it sounds like there's way, much more to come at this point, you would say, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Mark Cancian, thank you so much for joining us on the stream today. Moments ago, we just heard what the Russian government is saying about that call with President Trump. We'll have much more about that when we come back. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. Back to that breaking news on that phone call between President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The White House says, quote, the leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire, and permanent peace. These negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. Let's go back to CBS News correspondent Chanel Call, who is live in our newsroom. Chanel, what are you hearing from the Russian side about this conversation with Putin and Trump?
So, Muga, we know that this conversation between President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin got underway at about 10 a.m. Eastern. It lasted over 2 hours. This was a lengthy discussion, and we know now what the White House has said happened. Now we're getting some new details into our newsroom just moments ago from the Russian side. This is an unofficial translation of that meeting. So I'll highlight for you some key points, some key takeaways here. The first is that Vladimir Putin expressing his gratitude to Donald Trump for hosting this meeting and getting these talks underway. Now, in the context of the U.S. President's initiative to introduce this 30-day truce, that's what we know. This 30-day ceasefire was basically on the table today. According to this unofficial translation, the Russian side outlined a number of significant points regarding ensuring effective control over a possible ceasefire along the entire line of combat contact. It also emphasized, it says, the key condition for preventing the escalation of conflict and working towards a political and diplomatic resolution should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv. Mugo, you'll remember a lot of our correspondents and political pundits that we talked to leading up to this conversation today between the two presidents were warning that this is something that can happen. This is something that Ukraine was worried about. So this appears to be a key point to the Russians that they would like to see happen before they sign a 30-day truce. Also in here during this unofficial translation, it says, during the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from striking energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. You'll remember, Mugo, that Trump had said land and power plants are both part of this conversation around bringing the war to a close. He described this process as dividing up certain assets. So we'll have to see how that point plays out as well. The transcript says that the two discussed some other issues, including the situation in the Middle East as well as the Red Sea region. And I want to note as well at the very bottom of this unofficial transcript, it says Donald Trump supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organize hockey matches here in the U.S. and between Russia and American players playing in the NHL and KHL. So some interesting takeaways here. Again, we'll have to see how Ukraine responds to this new proposition. Mugo?
Yeah, interesting takeaways indeed, especially about the hockey part. That's just coming out of nowhere. But to your point earlier, yes, we know President Zelensky had insisted on the United States making sure there's some security guarantees in any potential ceasefire deal or an end to this war, because he just does not trust that President Putin would keep his word. At this point, though, and it's just a quick question for you, it doesn't seem like there's been any agreement on that 30-day ceasefire. Seems like more conversations will be held, right?
At this point, it does appear as though this is a conversation that's going to move forward, Mugo. Nothing has been signed or set in stone, and Ukraine needs to be on board with this as well. Obviously, after that fiery meeting, you'll remember 2 weeks ago, between President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, we weren't sure how this conversation would move forward. It does seem as though the ball is in Russia's court, but all three parties need to sign on for this to become a reality.
All right, Chanel, stick with us for just a moment because we have a different topic we want to discuss with you. Another story we're following, Chanel, is 12 people who were killed after a small plane crashed off the Caribbean coast on Monday. Now, Honduran officials say the jet stream departed from an airport on Roatan Island, and that's about 35 miles from the Honduran mainland, and it's also a popular diving destination. Chanel, what more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so Mugo, we're following this story really closely from our breaking news desk this hour. We know that this deadly crash happened sometime late last night, and authorities are saying this small plane crashed into the Caribbean Sea quickly after taking off from the Honduran island of Roatan. Take a look at these dramatic images, the video of the aftermath of this crash and the rescue effort that ensued shortly after. We know the Lanza Airlines plane took off from Roatan, which, you know, is a huge local tourist destination. And we're told now it was heading to a port on the Honduran mainland when this crash happened. Mugo, officials are saying the aircraft sort of made a sharp turn to the right of the runway and then fell into the water. Police are saying there were 15 passengers who were on board the plane, also 2 pilots and a flight attendant. So we know now that 12 people were killed in this crash, and that also notably includes a popular Honduran musician, Aurelio Martinez. Rescue workers, again, in these images, we're seeing carrying survivors onto a stretcher onto this very rocky shore. They were taken to a nearby hospital, but at this point, Mugo, we do not have an update on their conditions. Last we heard from police, they are still searching for one more person who was on board that plane. But you can see in these images here just how tough the terrain is. It is certainly complicating their search. You can see there's a grassy part here, but the plane crashed into the water. And around that body of water, there's about 30 meters of rock. So that's really what's making this search and rescue effort really tough. As for what caused the crash, police are saying this was an apparent mechanical failure. And in response, the president there has now issued an emergency committee to respond to the scene immediately. And this includes some armed forces and firefighters who are there to try to help the victims on scene.
Wow, just devastating. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call, thank you so much for those updates. Appreciate your time today. Welcome back. Google is making its biggest deal ever. Alphabet, the tech giant's parent company, announcing an agreement to buy cybersecurity platform Wiz for $32 billion. The deal would help Google as it competes against Microsoft and Amazon in the cloud-based space. Alphabet intends to pay more than last year's $23 billion bid for Wiz, which the Israeli-based startup rejected. That's a lot of money. The deal still has to be approved by regulators. Interest in cloud-based cybersecurity rose since last year's global meltdown triggered by the CrowdStrike outage. Okay, we have much more ahead right here on CBS News 24/7. We will continue to break down President Trump's call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin with analysis from experts and CBS News reporters in Washington. Stay with us.